Okay, good. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see so many of you here tonight. And I understand especially that we did a kind of an outreach to our secular Franciscan brothers and sisters around the area. And thank you for coming in great numbers. So we appreciate that very much. So let us begin then this evening with a prayer of Francis of Assisi, one that many of you are familiar with, his prayer before the crucifix. Oops. And already. Okay, stand by. All right, there we go. Okay. And we pray together. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity, sense and knowledge, Lord, that I may carry out your holy and true command. Amen. When the Companions of St. Anthony ministry began, it was described as a church without walls. In this lecture series, we are realizing that founding dream in a very particular way, using a technology that was undreamed of when the Companions of ministry began. Indeed, this technology allows us to do this series of talks, which will be actually very difficult to do for a live audience in a conference room. So we're grateful for this new way of communicating with you as our friends, our companions. So let us begin. In recent times, we have observed in this country and elsewhere, protesters being drawn to monumental images of famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, personages from the past. In some places, monumental images have been removed by local authorities and placed in storage. However, and more relevant to our interests in gathering tonight, in some places we have observed unauthorized attacks against monumental images, whereby these images have been figured, toppled, and destroyed. In my own native city, Baltimore, not far from here in Ellicott City, a monumental image of Christopher Columbus that was situated in a historically Italian neighborhood was toppled, beheaded, and dragged into the nearby waters of the harbor. Our interest here tonight is not to argue or even to consider the merits of these actions. Rather, what is thought-provoking to an uninterested beholder is how these protesters relate to these images. In a certain sense, these images are approached and treated as if they really were Christopher Columbus or Thomas Jefferson or even St. Junipero Serra in San Francisco. They are dragged away, attacked, destroyed, beheaded, as if they were the person depicted. And there's nothing new about this. History is full of moments where images that present persons or ideas through images or books have been demonized and destroyed. Again, the reason for bringing this up is not to argue the merits of the protesters' agendas. Rather, these events are reminders of the power that images still hold over 21st century persons. How, in some way, we still relate to these images as the person depicted. In summary, we see ourselves as not only beholders of these images, but as being beheld by them as well. In these images, we experience the person depicted. It is not hard to think of less extraordinary examples of this from everyday life. We place photographs of people we know and love, people we may have seen just an hour or so ago on our desks at work. We place photographs of deceased loved ones in a prominent, one may say sacred place in our homes, creating shrines, if you will. Consider this. Have you ever gone through your desk drawer or your Bible or your prayer book and found a holy card of some saint, one that you maybe do not even have a devotion to, and you're reluctant to throw it away, So you put it back, leaving it for whoever has to go through your things after you've gone to your eternal reward. Why? It seems we do this because we hold that there is some relationship between these images and the person depicted. To throw away that holy card is to dishonor, disrespect, do violence to that saint depicted. And we do this without even thinking about it. This seems to be a part of who we are, how we are made. The bottom line is this: images have presence. They have what 20th century philosopher and critic Walter Benjamin called aura, which he defines simply as an image that we look at and which looks back at us. In this series of 4 talks, we are going to focus on very early images of St. Francis of Assisi. This week, we will be celebrating the Feast of the Stigmata, remembering the event sometime about this date, which today is the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, back in 1224, when Francis of Assisi, during a hermitage experience at the mountain retreat called La Verna, had a mystical experience of a crucified man in the form of a seraph angel, and came away from that experience with the marks of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. In that moment, and for the rest of his earthly life and beyond, Francis of Assisi became an image of crucified Christ, if you will. And it is this image that very quickly became the standard iconographic convention for depicting St. Francis. St. Francis became the stigmatized saint, the marked saint, the wounded saint, and in turn, a beautiful saint. In the coming months, we will focus upon the death of Francis, Francis as a model for a penitential life, and finally, the story of Francis and Christmas at Giorgio in 1223. But tonight, let us focus on Francis as the stigmatized saint. So here's our project for this evening. First off, what is a Veda icon? What is this particular genre of art that we will be considering? How did Veda icons of St. Francis function in their original context? Why were they made, and what were they used for? How did they depict, in particularly the stigmata? And how can these images continue to be transformative of spirituality today? Tonight, we will introduce the earliest images of St. Francis that were produced, images that are not well known beyond the world of art historians. We will consider briefly the development of a very particular form of Christian artwork, the Veda icon, how these images functioned in their original context, and how they continue to offer to us a presence of the seraphic saint, and how they can be transformative of our spirituality. These Veda icons contain many scenes from the life and afterlife of Francis of Assisi. For reasons of time and in honor of the feast we are about to celebrate, tonight we will limit our consideration to the depictions of the stigmata and related scenes from the life of the saint. In our subsequent talks, we will consider other scenes from the life of Francis of Assisi from these same Veda icons. So first, what is a Veda icon? One of the precious gifts handed down to us from the early Franciscan movement is the surprisingly extensive corpus of writings by Francis of Assisi and the plethora of hagiographical lives, autobiographies in a certain sense, of St. Francis. These texts serve as the primary source for creating literary portraits of the saint. I'm sure many of us have read at least one of the countless biographies of St. Francis that have been produced over the last 800 years. And it is from these texts that each of us has crafted our own particular image of St. Francis, who Francis is for us.
Father Steve,
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt you for a moment, but you're not sharing the screen. It went away.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh,
Sorry.
that's okay. Sorry about that. Are you just seeing me?
We're just seeing you. Yeah.
Well, that's boring. I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right. How about now?
Excellent.
Okay, I'm sorry. I
Sorry.
apologize for that.
Sorry to interrupt.
No. I'm glad this would have been really awful without. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Now, perhaps you have even read some of the writings of Francis or some of the early hagiographical lives of the saint. In the English-speaking world, we have been blessed for the last 20 years to have access to excellent translations of these early sources. Francis of Assisi, early documents, was a massive enterprise. Providing these sources in translation, we should be grateful to the editors and translators of this monumental work. But these are translations of the early sources, and therein lies a clue to why iconographic sources for the life of the saint would also have been produced contemporaneously to these literary sources. Virtually all of the early sources were written in Latin. The average person of the 13th century Italy had little, if any, level of literacy. These people came to know about St. Francis not so much by reading, but through preaching and iconographic images, oftentimes simultaneously. A Franciscan preacher could stand before these images and use them as a prop or a preaching aid. The masterpiece of early Franciscan iconography is the Fresco Cycle, produced in the upper church of the Basilica of St. Francis at the end of the 13th century. This major work continued to serve that function of telling the story of St. Francis in visual images. And today, friars continue to tell the story of St. Francis using these images as a prop or preaching aid. But before the massive Fresco Cycle was produced, in the even more massive Basilica of St. Francis, there were other images crafted. Similar objects that expressed not only the story of St. Francis, but did so in a form that was simple, one might say poor. And that is where the images that are of interest to us tonight come in. Okay, good. Beginning shortly after the canonization of St. Francis in 1228 and continuing for most of the rest of the 13th century, a relatively new genre of visual imagery, at least in the West, was created to depict mostly Franciscan saints. These were not massive frescoes nor expensive stained glass windows, but rather simple panel paintings created on relatively small wooden panels. These images contained a large, full-length icon of the saint in the center of the panel, with anywhere from 4 to 20 small depictions of scenes from the life and afterlife of the saint surrounding the central icon. Because these icons contain scenes from the life, from the Vita of the saint, they are called Vita icons. Here we are seeing the oldest extant Vita icon of St. Francis, one commissioned for the Church of St. Francis in Pescia, Italy, a small town 112 miles northwest of Assisi, just west and north of Florence. Unique to the extant Vita icon genre, the image is both signed by the craft person that painted it, Bonaventure Berlinghieri, and dated to 1235, just 7 years after the canonization of the saint. On either side of the central icon, there are 3 scenes from the life of the saint. The two upper images are easily identifiable to anyone familiar with the life of St. Francis, the stigmatization of Francis and the preaching to the birds. Following that are images depicting 4 miracles that occurred after the death of the saint. So we have considered what a Veda icon is, but an unanswered question is, why were these produced? We've considered one reason this art form was created, to tell simply the story of St. Francis, to be what Pope St. Gregory the Great called the book of the illiterate. But there was also an important reason for why these images were created. Francis was buried in the living rock of Mount Sabazio, deep below the altar of the lower church of the Basilica of St. Francis. This incredibly unusual burial was done ostensibly as a security measure to prevent the relics of the saint from being stolen and taken to another city. Because of the way Francis was buried, there were no relics of the saint available to be distributed to the ever-growing number of churches dedicated to the new saint and administered by the friars. At that time, each altar in a church needed a relic, but there were no relics from the mortal body of St. Francis. Hence, these Veda icons were produced to serve as a relic substitute. They would have been mounted on or above the altar, serving as a presence of the saint in that worship space. This is very important for our understanding of the function of the Veda icon. These were not just beautifully crafted pictures of the saint in his life. They were iconographic presences of the saint in these churches, far from the tomb of the Poverello. These images were a way of extending the enduring presence of the saint to the churches of the Franciscan movement. Hence, the importance in these images of depicting miracle stories from after the earthly life of Francis. If one could not make the pilgrimage to Assisi, one could also come to the local presence of the saint in their own town, their own church, and seek their miracle there in the iconographic presence of the saint. Today, there are 8 Veda icons of St. Francis still in existence. As we briefly review each of these 8 images, I encourage you to be particularly attentive to the central icon. So now let me introduce you to my 8 friends. The first one we see before us is the one we've been talking about already, the Pescia panel, created in 1235, and the only one that's still in an active worship site. The Assisi panel, created about 1253 for the Basilica of St. Francis. This image served as a more proximate presence of the saint, who was buried deep below the lower church. The Rome panel, very similar to the Assisi panel and based on the Assisi panel, created for the papal court about the year 1255. The Pisa panel, also created about 1255. Note how similar format it is to the Pescia panel. One for the Bardi family channel in the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, created about 1260. The Orte panel, also created about 1260. The Pistoia panel, created between 1265 and 1275. And finally, the Siena panel, created about 1280. With the exception of the Rome icon, all of these images were produced for Franciscan churches. All of these were commissioned by the friars themselves and created by a craftsperson. Hence, the friars themselves had the ultimate control over what was depicted and the program of the arrangement of the particular narrative images. What is interesting about these images is that each one creates a local version of the saint, as it were. For example, the Orte panel has two stories about heretics being reconciled to the church. At the time of the creation of the Orte panel, the local Franciscan friars were involved in the Inquisition. The Assisi panel has only posthumous miracle stories, most of them occurring at the tomb of the saint, promoting the cult of the saint and the pilgrimage to Assisi itself. With this introduction to the Veda icon tradition complete, let us now turn to a specific aspect of these images, how they project the stigmata and its meaning into the world of the beholder. If you were attentive to the central icon of Francis in each of the 8 Veda icons, you perhaps noticed that in each of them, the figure of the saint had marks on both hands and on both feet. This is clearly seen here on the Pescia panel. Notice that these marks are just that. They are not holes or bleeding wounds, simply marks, as it should be. While the Veda icons should be treated as hagiographical sources for the life and afterlife of Francis, separate from the literary portraits of the saint, it is also true that the literary sources came first and serve as the basis for what is depicted in art. At the time that the Pescia panel was produced in 1235, the primary literary source available, as best we know today, were the initial works of Thomas of Celano, his Life of St. Francis, and an abbreviated liturgical text, the Legend for Use in Choir. Here is how he describes the stigmata of Francis in his Life of St. Francis. His hands and feet seem to be pierced through the middle by nails, with the heads of the nails appearing on the inner part of his hands, and on the upper part of his feet, and their points protruding on opposite sides. Those marks on the inside of his hands were round, but rather oblong on the outside, and small pieces of flesh were visible, like the points of nails, bent over and flattened, extending beyond the flesh around them. On his feet, the marks of nails were stamped in the same way and raised above the surrounding flesh. His right side was marked with an oblong scar, as if pierced with a lance, and this often dripped blood, so that his tunic and undergarments were frequently stained with his holy blood. While not slavishly controlled by the literary source, the icon presents simple marks on the hands and the feet. Notice also that there is no depiction of the side scar that sometimes dripped blood. In fact, none of the 8 extant Veda icons depict the side wound. On either side of the central icon are 6 narrative scenes from the life of Francis, 3 on each side. These narrative scenes are read from top left downward, and then top right and downward. Let us consider these scenes. So there you can kind of see the whole panel and how you can read them starting in the upper left and then down, and then you move to the right and then down. The first scene is the one we are most interested in, the stigmatization. Here we see Francis kneeling at the top of a barren, mountainous landscape, surrounded by architectural structures. This is a very typical Byzantine style of presentation. In the upper right, a 6-winged seraph angel with the face of a man bearing the same marks as Francis appears out of the heavenly firmament, depicted by the dark circles. Francis is kneeling in prayer with his hands extended in wonder. Notice how Francis is looking up at the seraph, yet the seraph is looking at the beholder. He's looking at us. This effective technique draws the beholder into this most intimate, mystical experience. Francis is gazing at the seraph The seraph is gazing at the beholder, and the beholder is gazing at Francis and the seraph, creating a circle of beholding. Here, the beholder is not just a voyeur, but is beheld by the seraph, a most effective presentation. Remember what we said earlier about the definition of images. You look at them, and they look at you. We now turn to the next scene, which is easily identifiable. Francis preaching to the birds. Notice that in this familiar scene that Francis bears the marks of the stigmata. Here, the producer of this icon has not followed the order of the narrative in the literary source. In Thomas of Celano's life, the preaching of the birds is well before the stigmata. This significant divergence from the literary source should make us curious and attentive. We now move to 4 stories from the afterlife of Francis of Assisi. The first is a miracle story from the day of the saint's temporary burial at the church of San Giorgio in Assisi. Here, a small girl with a twisted neck is brought to the church and laid beneath the coffin containing the saint's mortal relics. Also notice the 2 friars ministering at the coffin and witnessing the miracle. The girl is then healed, and we can see her lifted onto the shoulder of the woman as they depart the tomb, the church rather. Next, we see another miracle at the tomb of the saint. Notice the group of kneeling, crippled men. You can see their 4 short crutches on the floor before them. Leading the group is a young person reaching up to a friar who is handing him something. Notice that friar bears the stigmata on his visible hands. Also, notice the nimbus or halo surrounding his head. Clearly, this is St. Francis. But notice his youthful appearance. This is a depiction of the story of the paralyzed boy from the town of Montenero, who drags himself to the tomb of Francis. While there, a young friar gives him some pears and urges him to stand and walk. The boy protests, but the young friar hands him another pear and takes him by the hand, and the boy now walks. With that, the young friar disappears. Notice also the prominent presence of the standing man with a stick and bottle over his shoulder, and an instrument for making a sound in his right hand. This man is a leper, who by his appearance seems to have already been healed. The message of the scene is that Francis continues to be present at his tomb, performing miracles. Now we encounter the famous story of the healing of Bartholomew of Narnie. He was also crippled. Notice the 2 red crutches that he holds. He has a dream that tells him to go to a certain pool. While there, he feels someone who he does not see pulling on his leg, straightening it. It is Francis. Again, notice the stigmata. Having been healed, he leaves the scene with his no longer needed crutches cast jauntily over his right shoulder. This is the only miracle depicted that does not occur at the tomb of the saint. The message here is that Francis is not just a saint of Assisi, but a universal saint who can perform miracles anywhere. Finally, we have a scene of 3 people possessed by demons being freed. Notice the demons flying from their open mouths. Here, the producer has conflated a number of exorcism stories from the literary sources. Once again, we see friars ministering at the tomb of the saint, witnessing the miracle. So how are we to interpret the program of this icon? What does it mean? And what is the role of the stigmata in this image? Clearly, the message is that Francis is a new saint who is so closely conformed to Christ in his life in the world that he was graced with a new miracle, the stigmata. His conformity to Christ was so authentic and complete that he performed miracles in this life, like preaching to birds, as well as beyond the grave. Hence, Francis continues to be present. But there is more going on here. Before continuing with that thought, though, it's important to make an observation about the stigmata. Given that we have seen Francis as the stigmatized saint for 8 centuries, it is easy to forget that at one point in time, for example, when the Assisi Panel was produced, that this was a new spiritual phenomena. It had only been 8 or 9 years since this phenomena had become public knowledge. The medieval beholder must have gazed at this image with shock and wonder. Despite the well-known efforts of Francis to hide these marks from public view in his life, in his afterlife, these marks become the primary way that we come to know that this saint is Saint Francis, the stigmatized saint. Let us return to taking a closer reading of this image and what it is trying to communicate. A helpful clue comes from the shifting in the order of the stories in the life of Francis, the stigmata before the preaching to the birds. This shift is key. Having been conformed to Christ in the stigmata, Francis then goes on to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah, as Jesus did in his earthly ministry, in this restoration of the peaceable kingdom. Like Jesus, St. Francis interacts with creation in ways that defy the laws of nature. Birds, instead of flying away as they usually do, are attentive and obedient to Francis, listening to his preaching. In this narrative, we see Francis marked as the crucified Christ, then his preaching ministry, then 4 miracles which show him healing the sick, lepers, and those possessed by demons. Where have we heard these dynamics in this order before? In the gospel passage that inspired Francis's conversion. Thomas of Celano, in his Life of St. Francis, tells of how Francis heard the gospel proclaimed at the Porciuncula, that the disciples of Jesus dispossessed themselves of their possessions and preached the kingdom of God in penance. However, if we take a broader look at, for example, Matthew's version of the story, what do we find? As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of God is come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You receive without payment, give without payment. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belt, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics, or sandals, or a staff. Is it not interesting that this text provides the structure to the image? With the exception that in the first collection of miracle stories of Francis, he did not raise anyone from the dead. The other miracle stories from the gospel are presented in that same order. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick. Cleanse the lepers. Cast out demons. It is this gospel passage that inspired Francis, his form of life, and the form of life of his companions. When Francis and his first companions seek to have this form of life approved by Pope Innocent III, he sends them out to preach. Hence, the form of life of Francis and his companions is conformity to Christ, as expressed in the stigmata, and to preach as expressed by the preaching to the birds. By being faithful to that form of life, they will, like Jesus, heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. Hence, the beholder sees the image and exclaims with Thomas of Celano that he is a saint. The beholder is invited to seek miracles and to embrace the cult of the new saint of Assisi. But perhaps the beholder goes deeper and is inspired to embrace the evangelical form of life of Francis and his companions that is encoded into the program of the Pescia Panel. We now turn to what is arguably the masterpiece of the St. Francis Veda icon tradition, the image that has historically been associated with the Bardi family chapel at what was the Franciscan Church of Santa Croce in Florence. This image was produced about the year 1260, at around the same time that St. Bonaventure's official hagiographical life of St. Francis was also produced. As you can see, this is a very large panel painting. In reality, it's about 234 centimeters high. That's about 7, almost 8 feet, and 127 centimeters wide. Therefore, the central icon of Francis is at least life-sized. It is also by a wide margin the panel that contains the largest number of scenes from the life and afterlife of the saint, trumped only by the significantly larger Fresco Cycle in the upper church of the Basilica of St. Francis, which is indeed based on Bonaventure's official life of the saint. The vertical arrangement of scenes on the left depicts stories from his conversion, from his early conflict with his mother and father to Christmas at Giorgio. The horizontal register at the bottom depicts stories from his life from his conversion to his death, beginning with the preaching to the birds and ending with his tending to lepers after the Stigmata. In the vertical arrangement of scenes on the right, we see stories from the end of his life and his afterlife, beginning with his death and funeral up to the familiar healing of Bartholomew of Narnie. Focusing on the role of the stigmata in this image, let us begin by observing a very curious feature of the panel. Notice the arrangement of Francis's feet. Notice how his right foot is pointing to the left, and his left foot is pointing straight down. His right foot then is pointing to the story of Christmas at Giorgio, which we will consider at some length in our December talk. And his left foot is pointing at the story of the stigmatization. This curious feature highlights an important aspect of the spirituality of Francis and the movement that he inspired, its focus on the incarnation, in the birth and in the suffering and death of Jesus. Here in both of these stories, we see Francis having mystical experience related to these bookends of the story of the incarnation. We'll consider Giorgio later in December, but here the depiction of the stigmata is not that much different from the presentation in the Pescia panel. This shows how traditions of iconographic vocabulary, if you will, develop over time. Here, Francis is kneeling near the summit of a barren, mountainous landscape. Notice the similarities in the vegetation and the architectural feature. Also, the image of the Seraph, although damaged, bears a close resemblance to the Seraph of Pescia. However, there are some novelties here. It is difficult to see, but there are streaks of blood emanating from the marks in his hands, which is not mentioned in the official hagiographic sources of Thomas of Celano or Bonaventure. Francis's stance in the Oran's position with his hands up in the air, like you see, is also new and will be taken up by Giotto in his depictions of the stigmata, including the one that is presented as a fresco in the same Bardi chapel of Santa Croce. Hence, while this depiction of the stigmata has one foot in the established iconographic tradition, it also offers some new developments that will transform that same tradition, creating the standard images that continue to be produced up to our own time. The theme of the stigmata is continued in the Bardi panel in the scene immediately to the right of the Laverna story. This next story helps to plumb the depth of the meaning of the stigmata in the life of Francis, and an essential element of his life history that is neglected in almost all of the other Veda icons. Let us consider the words of Francis himself at the beginning of his testament. This text, composed by Francis in the last days of his life, offers a rare autobiographical insight. Here is how that important text begins. The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, thus to begin doing penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. And afterwards, I delayed a little and left the world. Here, Francis described in his own words his conversion experience, his experience of metanoia in his life among and service to the lepers of Assisi. It is this experience that propels him onto the spiritual odyssey that inspired the Franciscan movement. However, the Testament knew a troubled history. In later sections of the text, Francis offers a rather challenging interpretation of the form of life, especially regarding poverty. After his death, the friars were uncertain if this text was binding on how they lived the rule. In their uncertainty, they turned to Pope Gregory IX to make a ruling, and he proclaims that the Testament was not binding on the friars. This ruling led to a period where the Testament becomes, in a fashion, a persona non grata. Hence, this story is not depicted in the iconography of the 13th century. And even when it appears in the literary sources, it tends to be over-spiritualized, where the emphasis is placed on the story of Francis meeting a leper on the road, rather than living his life with real lepers. Again, we're all familiar with that story of Francis meeting the leper on the road. He gets off his horse, he embraces the leper, kisses the leper, and the leper disappears. It's the famous magic leper, disappearing leper, right? But that's not what Francis talks about, as we see in the Testament. Here in the Bardi panel, and again, remember, this is the scene immediately after the Stigmata. In the Bardi panel, we see Francis living with and serving real lepers. But notice where this story is placed. Not at the beginning of his life, in the left column of scenes that are related to his conversion, but in the horizontal register of stories from his life after his conversion. Here we see an interesting use of narrative, as Francis appears twice in this one scene. Both Francises bear the stigmata. In the left side of the frame, we see a leper, whose skin is marked with the wounds of his disease, sitting on the lap of Francis like a child. But there is a later analog that is even more telling. This image of Francis is reminiscent of Michelangelo's Pietà, where Mary is holding the dead body of her son Jesus. Here we see Francis holding, in a motherly fashion, the body of one who was one of the living dead. Recall how lepers were treated in the Middle Ages, how they were cast out from society and forced to live under very strict laws that kept them separated from other people. To the right of the first Francis, we see a towel hanging on the wall. And then the second Francis, with the same towel at his waist, as he cleans the wounds of a leper, as two other lepers await their turn. Here, Francis is depicted similarly to the way we often see Jesus washing the feet of the disciples at the Last Supper. Notice the look of happiness on the faces of these lepers, whose bodies are also marked with the wounds of their disease. Here, the wounded saint tends to the wounds of his brother lepers. Like Jesus, he washes the feet of his friends. An incredibly poignant, moving scene. But why is this story presented after the Stigmata scene? It's because of a relatively obscure observation in the life of St. Francis by Thomas of Celano. He wanted to return to serving lepers and to be held in contempt, just as he used to be. He intended to flee human company and go off to the most remote places, so that, letting go of every care and putting aside anxiety about others, for the time being, only the wall of the flesh would stand between him and God. Again, this is after the Stigmata and before the narrative of the death of Francis. Just as the experience of being with and serving the lepers had been true religious experience, that is, an experience of God, in the earliest days of his doing penance, so in the last days of his life, he desired to return to that same experience of God among the lepers. Instead of reveling in the amazing wonder and sign of the Stigmata, showing the world the heights of his conformity to Christ, rather he desires to hide this gift and to enter more deeply into the experience of God found with the living dead, the lepers. Hence, the experience of the Stigmata was not so much the summit of his mortal life, but an inspiration to delve even more deeply into the mystery of the incarnation itself, to live as Jesus did, to wash the feet of the most marginalized of his world, and to find God present there. The Stigmata was not an end, but the beginning of a deeper relationship with God, a season of his life that would end with his own embrace of Sister Death and his coming to eternal life. As an epilogue to this section, let us turn briefly to one scene from the Pistoia panel, produced after the Bardi panel between approximately 1265 and 1275. As you can see in this panel, the space in the gabled section at the very top of the panel, on either side of the head of the central icon of Francis, is used in a clever way. Under the right gable is the scene of the Stigmata that is highly reminiscent of the depictions in the Pescia and the Bardi panels. To the left is a scene from early in the life of Francis. Here we see Francis kneeling before Pope Innocent III. Francis is presenting a written copy of the primitive form of life to the Pope, and the Pope is accepting that form of life with his left hand and gesturing with a blessing with his right hand, which also is a sign of him sending Francis and his companions back into the world to preach penance. But notice the tiny architectural feature at the very left of the scene. Notice what is hanging on the wall. It's a towel, almost identical to the one in the scene with the lepers in the Bardi panel that we have just considered. This is no coincidence. The message is clear. It may have been politically untenable to depict Francis living among and serving lepers in a scene from his early life because of the questionable status of the testament. However, the producer of the Pistoia panel includes this almost subliminal symbol in this image. Just as Francis came away from the Stigmata, desiring to return to serve the lepers, it was that same service to the lepers that inspired the movement in the first place. Francis leaves, if you will, his dwelling with the lepers to seek approval from the church for this novel form of life. In a certain sense, on his way in to see the Pope, he leaves the towel hanging there And it is this religious experience among the lepers that would inspire his preaching penance, preaching conversion. And it is the faithful living of that form of life that will lead to the scene under the gable on the right, the stigmatization. With this, the story is complete. So, what are the Veda icons of St. Francis? So, to wrap up, what are these images? They are hagiographical sources. Although they are bounded by the limits of visual imagery in communicating narrative, they are still sources for the life of the saint that deserve the same attention, both scholarly and as spiritual reading, if you will, as the literary sources for the saint. They are propaganda, as we have seen. They promoted the cult of the new saint. And again, when I'm using the word cult, I'm not talking about like wacky, religious folk, but cult in the sense of devotion to, the normal use of the word, or a normal use of the word. They promoted the cult of the new saint and promoted membership in the spiritual movement founded by Francis and his companions. Finally, they are presences of the saint. They are images that allow us to behold the saint and for the saint to behold us. Remember that these are images that we look at and look back at us. To conclude then, let's consider how these images of the wounded saint can be transformative of spirituality today. First, as what I call prisms of perfection. In these images of the saint with the stigmata, we see Francis of Assisi presented as spiritually and physically conformed to Jesus Christ. The emphasis in early Franciscan iconography on the stigmata makes this particular image of Francis as in conformity to Christ most prevalent and provocative. When we look at these images of the saint, we can ask ourselves, who are we seeing, Francis or Christ? As it should be. What is a saint? Is it not someone who has truly conformed their life to that of the gospel? In the Eastern churches, there is a remarkable interest in the transfiguration of Christ. In the theology of the East, what the apostles saw was the uncreated light of the glory of God in the dazzling splendor of that miraculous, mystical experience. They were seeing the light of God as it truly is, the light of God shining through Jesus of Nazareth. In an icon, the beautiful, dazzling gold backgrounds are not there to simply grab our attention. It is there to remind us that in the saints, that same light of Christ is shining into our world through the saint. However, that light is refracted, shaped as in a prism through the life and history of that saint. So in the Veda icons of St. Francis, we see that beautiful light of Christ in a Franciscan shape, refracted by the life, history, preaching, and writings of Francis of Assisi. Hence, when we look at St. Francis, when we come into his presence, we are also coming into the experience of Christ, shining through the beautiful life of the saint. In a related way, the Veda icons of the saint are also mirrors. As Walter Benjamin observed, in images, we also see ourselves reflected. In the Veda icons of the wounded, beautiful saint, we see our own lives reflected, for better or worse. We see our own conformity to the sufferings of Francis, the sufferings of Christ. We see our own response of compassion or not. Hence, these images challenge us to seek the grace we need to shape, to transform our lives into conformity with the beautiful, wounded saint of Assisi, which is, in turn, a particular expression, manifestation of the uncreated light of Christ shining into our own world. Well, thank you for this opportunity to share my passion and my friends with you tonight. I'll turn it back now to Mission Control and Joe Hamilton to offer another important word from our sponsors and to facilitate any questions you might have.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Father Stephen. I do have a couple of questions. You keep talking about hagiography. And in biography, these two terms keep going around. Can you tell us what hagiography is?
Okay, sure. That's a great question. So hagiography literally means hagio means saint, and graphy means writing. So it's writing about a saint. And every saint, even today, when a saint is canonized, there is a life written about the life of the saint, right? In Francis's case, there were many of these produced over many years, but they were written to showcase his life as a saint. So they're not biographies as we would understand. So they're not interested in, he was born in 1281, his mother's name was this, blah, 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 and he died in 1226, at 8:30 at night. They're not interested, it's not biography in that sense, right? But rather interpretations of the saint to help us to understand that this person, he or she, is indeed a holy person and a model for us. So hopefully we see in that interpretation inspiration to inspire us to follow the saint's good example. Now, the interesting thing with that is the whole notion of, for hagiography has existed much longer than biography. Biography is a modern idea. Even history, the idea of history as we understand it, is a modern idea. And in fact, we can often fall into the trap of reading history as if we are reading what really happened. What we're reading is somebody's interpretation of what really happened, right? So if you see some event, you could write a story about it, and I could see the same event and write a story about it, and it could be quite different, right? Because we all have our own agendas, we all have our own interests, we have our own biases, and therefore it's a caution when we read a biography or works of history today, even Franciscan things. It's always through the lens of the person writing it. That's what we learn that from these Veda icons, because this is the friars looking at the life of Francis, right, and interpreting that, right? And we'll talk more about that next time, actually. Okay, but hagiography was, again, just to briefly, it's intended to promote, devotion to the saint. So we don't want to the caution is, be careful how you read these texts, right? If I can take a minute more about this. Okay, all right. And just to show you kind of how this works. I lived for 4 years in Canterbury, England. Outside of Canterbury, there is a church of St. Martin of Tours. It's the oldest church in England. It still is a church, right? It's from the 8th century or something. And you go in there and there's stained glass windows. And here's Martin of Tours giving his cloak to a poor beggar. Here is an image of Martin of Tours embracing a leper. And you see this, you say, I thought this was Martin of Tours, not St. Francis. But what happens is these stories become tropes, as we say. So like every saint in the Middle Ages had to kiss a leper, right? And that's why we need to be careful with that, but what we learned from Francis is, no, he didn't just kiss a leper just because that's what saints do. He lived with them. This was a real experience of his life that truly shaped him in his own desire to be conformed to Christ. So that's why we need to be careful in reading, again, every saint kisses a leper, every saint gives his stuff away to poor people, every saint talks to birds, but in St. Francis's case, we can see how this all fits into the story, and how it shapes the narrative for his life, and especially as we see him conformed to Christ.
Thank you. One other question. These Veda icons, so the lives of Francis, it's a real common image, that is the saints in the middle, and then you've got these scenes of life on either side. And I was immediately thinking of the ones of Francis and Clare that are reproduced quite. I think Cimabue may have made the Francis. Maybe I'm misremembering.
Well, there's actually no. There's all kinds of people. This is a form of presentation. It's an art genre that disappeared at the beginning of the 14th century and never was seen again until modern times. And now you'll have modern artists creating these images again. So, for example, in the friary here, unfortunately, it's in the friar part where nobody goes, but there is a modern one, and maybe that's where your question comes from. So, the central icon is the Cimabue Francis from the Lower Basilica. It's a copy, and on the sides are stories from his life that are very different from any of the ones that you would see in the medieval versions.
Yeah.
So people still make
Sure.
it's kind of there's been a renaissance in this form.
Sure. Well, let's give Father Stephen a round of applause. Thank you, Father Stephen.
My pleasure.
I also want to thank Mr. Riley Gates and Mr. Michael Sawicki, our technical support that helped make this series happen. And thank you all for coming tonight. We hope you will join us for the second session of the series, Killing Francis of Assisi, the death of Francis, the creation of Saint Francis. You'll look for an email invite soon. And finally, we can't offer programs like this without the generous support of friends. So if you were enriched by the session tonight, please consider a gift to the Companions of St. Anthony. And on behalf of the Conventual Franciscans, I wish you peace and all good things. Good night.